I guess the cult Grindhouse series beginning responsibility.
That's Dr. Gym Teacher to you. Now drop and give me 20. Let us go home.
Just before lunch one day, a puppet show was put on at school. It was called Mr. Bungle Goes to Lunch.
By August Wilson.
Then again, we eat paste.
In the puppet show, Mr. Bungle came to the boys' room on his way to lunch. He looked at his hands.
He wept.
And his hair was messy.
And his breath reeked of sternum.
Mr. Bungle didn't stop to wash his hands or comb his hair. He went right to lunch.
Still, he was the cleanest person in the Taco Bell.
Instead of getting into line at the lunchroom, Mr. Bungle pushed everyone aside and went right to the front.
As the biggest, it was his right.
No one thought that was a fair thing to do.
Except for Timmy the idiot, who didn't know what fair meant.
Then in the lunchroom, Mr. Bungle was so clumsy and impolite that he knocked over everything, and no one wanted to sit next to him.
So they ate off the floor.
His own tray off the table, that was the end of the puppet show.
Except for 3 encores.
Mr. Bungle was funny to watch. He wouldn't be much fun to eat with. Phil knew that Mr. Bungle wouldn't have many friends. He wouldn't want to be like Mr. Bungle.
Mrs. Bungle, on the other hand.
Miss Brown said it was time for the children who ate in the cafeteria to go to lunch. She hoped there weren't any Mr. Bungles in this room.
The children found this strange because Mrs. Brown so desperately needed any man she could get.
Phil stopped to return a book to Miss Brown while his friends went on to the lunchroom. He would have to catch up with them later.
Phil liked all the books in the Elders of Zion series.
To catch up with his friends, Phil almost walked past the boys' room, but he stopped and thought. Were his hands clean? No, they were a little dirty. Phil remembered that Mr. Bungle didn't wash his hands.
But Phil was in a hurry.
Mr. Bungle's hair was messy, too. Phil didn't want to be like Mr. Bungle.
He decided to shave his head and cut off his hands.
Phil was surprised to see some of his friends washing their hands, too.
Jenny?
Phil washed his hands well, with lots of soap.
Then
he rinsed the soap off.
Even though Mr. Bungle didn't specifically address that, Phil thought it was implied.
Phil dried his hands well, too. When he was finished, he threw the paper towel in the basket where it belonged. And then he made sure that his hair looked neat.
He was embarrassed how long and unkempt it had gotten.
Phil and his friends were ready for lunch.
Just in time for class to begin again.
Boys will repress all their instincts to be boys.
There was a line of children waiting to get into the lunchroom when Phil got there. He saw some boys he knew at the front of the line.
So he did his Miss America impression.
But Phil didn't want to break into line as Mr. Bungle did.
Mr. Bungle, Mr. Bungle, 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 Mr. Bungle.
Fair thing to do. He would see his other friends inside the lunchroom.
From his seat at the nerd table.
First, he picked up his tray.
You know who else picked up their tray? Hitler!
Then he got his silverware.
Just before Harpo Marx stole it all.
He put his knife, fork, and spoon neatly on the tray. And then he slid his tray along.
Phil tried to whistle a tune to keep his mind off Mr. Bungle.
In my head.
It tasted good, and was good for him, too.
My favorite vegetable is ketchup.
Phil decided to take the hot lunch.
He enjoyed flaunting it to the kids who couldn't afford it.
Butter, too. And he knew what else he wanted. Milk.
That milk.
On the tray. Maybe there was more milk. So he said,
Yo!
Phil remembered to say, may I, and please. That was very polite. Yes, there was more milk.
You have to eat around the lumps, kid. This was out in the sun.
Phil remembered to say, thank you, when he took the carton of milk. Phil had good manners. He didn't want to be like Mr. Bungle in the lunchroom.
Mr. Bungle, Mr. Bungle, Mr. Bungle, Mr. Bungle.
The cake looked in the... At the end of the line, the lunchroom supervisor said she had noticed how polite Phil was, and she smiled at him. She wouldn't smile at a Mr. Bungle.
Or an Oriental kid.
Put his tray down carefully, pulled out his chair quietly, and sat down. He knew his friends wouldn't like a noisy Mr. Bungle at their table. There was someone Phil liked, Freddie.
Freddie Bungle.
His lunch from home. It looked good. Freddie had a sandwich, an apple, a cookie, and milk.
He would always give you his cookie because he wanted you to like him.
Before Phil began to eat, he always put a napkin on his lap. So did Freddie.
Copycat.
Everyone liked Freddie. He was very polite. For example, if he had food in his mouth when someone talked to him, he always took time to chew the food with his mouth closed and swallow before he answered.
The string of obscenities.
How straight and tall Freddie usually sat. Freddie kept his feet on the floor, too.
I love Freddie.
Phil would rather be like Freddie than like Mr. Bungle. Another polite person everyone liked was Alice.
Played by Hayden Panettiere.
This protected her friends at the table from any germ.
Which she had in spades.
A boy ran past their table. You shouldn't run in the lunchroom. Only Mr. Bungle would do that.
He would hang himself in the bathroom.
Phil and his friends wouldn't like to have a Mr. Bungle at their table. Then lunchtime wouldn't be as much fun as it is.
We are having fun.
He enjoyed his lunch. Finally, he had eaten everything except his dessert.
He ate Freddie?
He saved the cake for last. Only a Mr. Bungle would eat his dessert and finish the rest of his lunch. And Phil wasn't a Mr. Bungle. The cake was good.
Phil imagined that birthday cake might taste this good.
Phil drank his milk carefully. Some children are messy when they drink milk.
Phil just sucked.
After Phil's friends finished, they didn't leave the table, but waited for all the others to finish eating too.
Hovering like vultures.
With the last one done, he wiped his mouth and hands carefully with his napkin. Then he cleaned the table where he sat. He didn't want to leave his place at the table dirty.
He feared the consequences.
Everyone at the table cleaned his own place well. But look at that table. It was left very messy.
It's practically a biohazard.
Mr. Bungle must have sat there.
Or the poor children who lived at the Y.
But Phil didn't want to be like Mr. Bungle. So he put his chair neatly into place.
Catastrophe averted.
And his table looked fine. Not a piece of paper or scrap of food was left on it.
Freddie had licked it clean.
No, Mr. Bungle sat here.
These sowed their thoughts.
His friends were careful to put their waste papers and empty milk cartons where they belonged. In this way, they helped keep the lunchroom clean.
And developed unlikable personality traits.
Mr. Bungle wouldn't put his paper in the waste basket and his empty carton on the milk tray. Mr. Bungle probably wouldn't bother to put his lunch tray in the right place either, but Phil and his friends did.
His friends Rod and Todd Flanders.
And then Miss Brown told Phil and his friends how proud she was of them. They had left their table the neatest in the lunchroom. No one here was a Mr. Bungle, and no one wanted to be.
No one who mattered anyway.
Unlike Mr. Bungle,
Mr. Who?
Mr. Bungle is ashamed because he spoils lunchtime.
He's quite pleasant at dinner.
Have good lunchtime manners, and lunch will be more fun for everyone.
Phil became an accountant and was only invited to co-workers' parties after he found out about them accidentally.
Freddie broke his leg as Dennis the Menace's stunt double.
Alice can be seen in the Cornet production Cooking to Please Your Man. And Senator Bungle's doing all right for himself.